Welcome to the StoryLearning podcast, regular doses of language learning tips and motivation to help you become fluent in any language. With me, Olly Richards. For language programs, books, free resources, and much more, visit StoryLearning.com. Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to the I Will Teach You a Language podcast. Today, I present to you part 2 of my conversation with Scott Young. And we're going to be talking about his principles of ultralearning and how these apply to language learning. I hope you enjoyed part 1. If you're coming to this new, then don't start here. Go back 1 episode and check out part 1 of the conversation because that will set the tone. In this episode, we're going to talk about lots of things, including a lot about Chinese characters, actually. That comes right at the end of the conversation. But we also cover a lot of the material that from his book that we didn't get to in the last conversation, particularly what other aspects of ultralearning are relevant to language learning. So things like, for example, recall and the importance of recalling what we've learned in conversation, the concept of directness versus drills in learning, and much, much more. As ever, there are full extensive show notes that accompany this episode. Please go to iwillteachyoualanguage.com/blog to find the full blog post surrounding this episode. We have extensive show notes for you so you can look over and remind yourself of everything that we've spoken about. And I guess the only thing to say about that is if you're listening years in the future, then you might have to scroll down quite a long way on the blog page to find this interview. But you can just instead type in Scott Young into the search bar on the website, and I'm sure it won't be too difficult to find. So with that said, please enjoy part 2 of my conversation with Scott Young.
I want to stray slightly from the ultra working theme, but I'm just interested to get your perspective on it because I think my background with languages is I've just been doing it a long time, so I've kind of been through the language learning process a bunch of times, and by the time you hit your 3rd, 4th language, you know the territory, So yeah. I've kind of just clawed myself up the language ladder, if you like, just step by step. And in the last few years, I've I think partly because of my website and wanting to create content on the topic of language learning and stuff like that, I've done a number of language projects, along the same lines as what you're describing there, fast learning projects. I went to Thailand and I did a 2-week Thai project. Last year, I spent 3 months learning Italian, and I did it partly for me, but partly also because I wanted to document it and talk about the processes. But you see, I hate saying the older I get because it makes you sound so sort of I don't know, grand or something. But the more time I spent doing this, I had a different problem starting to emerge, which is like, take the case of Italian. I got very good at learning a language in 3 months to the point where I can kind of have a conversation and stuff like that. Yeah. It's what happens afterwards that I struggle much more with because, let's take the case of Thai and Italian, 2 languages which I worked hard at. And I kind of thought before starting those projects, once I learn them, I can just, even if I don't reach a high level, I can just maintain them and speak to people around London where I live and all these different things. Yeah. But inevitably, once the kind of glamour and excitement of the project wears off and you're kind of faced with the kind of cold, hard reality of right now, I've got this beast that I have to actually maintain and work at. Yeah. More and more, I've just been letting these languages fall away because I move on to other things that I want to spend my time on. So my question is, I guess what I wanted to ask you was, how do you, from the ultralearning mindset, how do you think about the problem of the much more difficult problem, I think, of maintaining and gradually improving a language into the long term, which is not just a case of there's no ending. It's not just a few years, it's the rest of your life. So how do you just think about that?
You know what is so funny? Because we were talking before this started about how you had not had a chance to read this book because I guess the copy never got sent to you or this kind of thing. Yeah. And it's just the fact that you're like just teeing up whole chapters that I've written is just like, the synchronicity of the thinking is like, well, what do you do about this problem? It's like, well, as in chat, no.
I'm really looking forward to reading it now.
I have a whole principle on retention, and I think what you're saying is absolutely right. Now, we're talking about how do you first get to a level where you can have a conversation, because most people, that's their stumbling block, right?
Yeah.
Spanish. So this is a little bit of like a rich man's problem, right? Like it's a little bit like this is first world language learning problems. It's like, well, I've learned so many languages. How do I maintain them all, right? It's a different problem from someone who really wants to start speaking. However, I completely agree with you. Maintenance is a real pain in the ass for learning languages. And I think it's particularly troublesome because the assumption, I think, of a lot of people is that once you learn it, you should know it forever. And that's just not really how the brain works, that we are constantly forgetting things, especially things that we're not actively using. And so for me, I kind of had, again, this is like, I've learned all these things through making mistakes in them. So all of my principles are like, well, I did it the wrong way first, so now this is the right way. And for me, one of the things is that I had done projects, including French, and I didn't have any maintenance strategy. I had no like post learning it strategy for what to do with these languages and or for these subjects. And then you find like, 6 months or a couple of years later, you're like, oh, wow, it's super difficult. Oh my God. Like I spent so much time learning this and now I can't use it. And so for me, I knew two things. I knew one, that I wanted in this short period of time, you learn 4 languages in 1 year. It's super intense. Therefore, it's also going to be forgotten super quickly. Like that was one major worry. As I was thinking, if I just did one at a time, maybe there would have been a little bit of like, trail off of practicing it, if I'd just gone to Spain. But we went to 4 countries. So there was a lot of like, even, you're learning Spanish and then immediately it's Portuguese, like you're immediately switching gears again. And so I knew that it was going to be a problem for the project. And the second thing is, like you said, like I'm doing these projects publicly on my blog. So I don't want to be like 6 years later, oh yeah, I can't speak any of those. Like that was a fun project, but I can't do any of that anymore. And so one of the things that I tried to do was setting up a very deliberate strategy for maintaining it. So for me, what I did is I spent about like half an hour per language per week in the beginning using italki, just italki.com, and just setting up a tutoring session to just have a conversation. And I think for the first year, I was once a week with each of them. And then
that's pretty good for a whole year, to keep that up for a whole year.
Second and third years, I was doing it probably once a month per languages. And recently I've been doing it more sporadically, but I found that taking that taper off kind of the practice has made it much better. And so, we can talk a little bit more. There's other retention techniques, but I think that's pretty important.
Okay, so we've covered a few different aspects of language learning. What are some of the things in your Ultralearning framework that we haven't mentioned that would be helpful to the process of taking on a new language or improving existing?
So a good example, like, I have these kind of 9 principles. So there's tons of stuff. Like this has been my life for the last decade. So I really tried to make it dense and include as much useful things, but also things that, were surprising to me even when I was in the research. And one of the principles that when I made my little proposal for the publisher, and I was like, I think these are going to be what the principles are. I've been doing this for a long time, so I think these are going to be the principles. And there were a few modifications when you do some research and you're like, oh, wow, there's actually a ton of research on this. And one of the principles, which I hadn't considered, which ended up becoming in the book just because of how much research there is supporting this, is this idea known as retrieval. And so the idea of retrieval is particularly relevant if you're going to be learning something in an academic setting. I think it's relevant for all subjects, but that's where it's like the strongest kind of contrast between what students often do and what actually works. And so there's a really interesting study done by Jeffrey Karpicki and Janelle Blunt. And in this study, they took students and they divided them up into multiple groups. One of the groups, they got to do a repeated review. So review, what that means just is that you have your text and you just read it kind of over and over again, or you keep looking at it over and over again to study it. Very common method of studying, including in language classes where you write down all your words and you just look over your lists of words again and again and again. The other group of people, they got to do free recall, which means you read the text once and then you shut it and then you try to recall everything that was in the text, or everything that you can recall that was in the text. And what they found is that after they did this, so before they did any testing or anything, they asked the students, how well did you learn the information? So how well do you think you studied? And the people who did repeated review gave themselves the highest marks. They said, you know what, I got this. I've got it. I know it really well. People who did free recall and other ads were like, oh man, I don't know this at all. Like I don't remember anything from the text. And what was interesting is that when you actually test them after, so when you actually give them a test to see how much they actually learned, it's the opposite. That the people who did free recall score much better than the people who did repeated review. And what I find interesting about this is that it's a clear example of where our intuitions about what works and what's effective is very different from the reality. And they actually have a very interesting scientific explanation for why this might be the case, why you might see this result. And the reason is that we don't actually have privileged access in our own minds to how well we're going to remember something. So you all know that you go to a party and someone says their name and you're like, oh, hi, I'm Mike. And then you're like, oh yeah, I'm Mike. And then like 20 seconds later, you're like, oh crap, what was his name again? And this is because when he was saying Mike, you have no idea whether you're going to remember that information. That's not actually an ability you possess to know how well you're going to remember something. Instead, your brain substitutes it with something slightly different. And that is what they call fluency of processing. So if something is fluent, in this case, it just means that you can do it smoothly, and it's not related to fluency in terms of language. But if you can process something fluently, then you think to yourself, I've mastered this content. And if you read something over and over and over again, what happens is that you get more and more familiar with it. It becomes, oh yeah, I've seen this, and becomes easier and easier to process. And so you are substituting the ability to recall something with the ability to process it fluently. And so because you're processing it very fluently, you think you've remembered it very well, even though you haven't. In contrast, free recall, you're not processing it fluently. It's very difficult, right? It's very difficult to recall things from a text. And because of that, you are, giving yourself low scores because, again, you're using that proxy. However, if you actually go to a situation where you're testing it, recall was the thing that you wanted to practice. That's actually very close to what you need to be able to do on a test. And the interesting thing about this is that it's a kind of universal principle, even above and beyond this idea of directness or this idea of limiting the amount of transfer that you have to do. And so if you're going to learn any language, that should be one of the top priorities of you, is not only making sure you're practicing retrieval rather than review. So you should be doing, whether it's flashcards, whether it's conversation practice, whether it's grammar exercises with the book closed. You should be practicing recalling things from memory. That's super important. But also the difficulty of which you recall things from memory and what are the cues that you use to recall from memory are also super important. So one of the things that I said about Duolingo that I don't like is that one of their main exercises is picking words from a word bank. Now, in a sense, this is a kind of retrieval. You have to figure out, okay, which one of these ones was the right word. However, this is essentially a recognition test, like multiple choice, is strictly easier than having to recall the word with no cue, right? So free recall. So there's a spectrum of difficulty from, I'm going to give you almost all of the answer and you just have to tell me which one, to, all right, no hints, what's the answer? There is a spectrum here with various stages in the middle. And one of the researchers, R.A. Bjork, has found that the more difficult retrieval is, the more valuable it is for long-term memory. And this seems to be related to the idea that just when you're actually speaking a language, you need to retrieve it from memory in contexts where there often aren't any cues to give you hints. So you only know, let's say, the English word that you want to say. You don't have any cues of like, well, it's one of these three, right? You're not doing a multiple choice exercise. And so the fact that, Duolingo and these things tend to use this fairly weak form of retrieval will probably also mean that it will not only have problems transferring, but it also means that it's going to be a lot harder to really retain that information in useful content.
So to try and give this, to crystallize this in language learning terms, is what you're saying the equivalent of, is a good parallel of what you're saying, the difference between, for example, reading a sentence in the target language and being able to recognize it, as opposed to having to recall what that sentence is from nothing, from say the English prompt, and you having to recall that sentence. Or in other words, a flashcard, if you imagine a flashcard with the English on one side and the Spanish on the other, the difference between you being shown the Spanish and saying, what does this mean in English? And you being shown the English and say, right now, do you remember what the Spanish is? Is that apparent?
Yeah, so I think in language learning, I'm glad you brought this up, because language learning makes the conceptualization of this a little difficult, because both of the so I would say target language to your native language and your native language to target language are actually both recall tasks. They're just different recall tasks.
Right.
So if you're going from Spanish to English, for instance, you still have to recall the English words that match. So it's still a retrieval act. It's not the same retrieval act so they're not mirror versions of each other. If you practice one, you may not be able to do the other.
Yeah, one is considerably harder than the other as well,
my tendency is to think that production is generally harder than listening, because you are more familiar with the English words than the target language words. So there is a asymmetry there in which one is a more difficult activity. That being said, I've had conversations with our friend Olly about Chinese, and he's made the claim before that listening in Chinese is more difficult than speaking Chinese, which again, if you follow this logic, that doesn't seem to make any sense, because listening is a kind of strictly easier task because you have to recognize a word and translate it into the language that you know well versus the other direction. However, that doesn't take into account that when you are producing, you're usually producing from a much more limited range of vocabulary than you are when you're listening. So that there's a much higher chance, for instance, that if someone says a sentence in like fluent native level language ability, that they will use words and terminology that are less frequent.
Yeah, the tasks aren't the same there, are they? Because
So I think they're both important. So I would treat them separately. And I think the idea here is that when I'm talking about the difference between review or recognition versus recall, is that recognition would be like a multiple choice test, or even easier, just, people just have lists of they wrote down a bunch of words on their notebook and then they just look over them and they're like, oh, right, hablar means to speak, and that's written on my paper right here. That's a recognition task. If you cover up one of the sides, you do have a recall task. You have different recall tasks. So again, this is getting a little bit into the kind of technical things, but I think this is really interesting, is that what we're talking about when we talk about learning things, in my opinion, is very much we're talking about a set of cues leading to a particular set of knowledge. And so again, if the cue is the English or the cue is the target language, you're actually dealing with slightly different learning tasks. So it's not just you're learning how to say this in the language. You're either learning to produce it, you're learning to hear it, and there's overlap there. So there is some transfer between those activities, so that, if you are speaking something, you could think about that time someone said something to you that they said that, and they're like, well, what was that word they said? And then I can use that word. However, they're a little bit more different and separate than the kind of, like we were talking about, that sort of false analogy of the brain, that it's just, you're just storing data in your brain, and you're just, it turns out that actually retrieving things in the right situations is super important. And so in many ways, I think it's useful to view those as almost slightly separate learning tasks.
Over the years, my approach to language learning has changed a bit. So back in the day, I would, with my kind of language hacking hat on, I would approach a new language with the very much in the mindset of, right, let's go out and explicitly learn and memorize stuff. So when I first started learning Cantonese, one of my languages, I would do a lot of work with flashcards, trying to explicitly memorize stuff. The idea being that, if you can bring memory techniques to play, and you can use them to effectively acquire, retrieve, and recall bits of information, then you can quite reliably move your at least your degree of knowledge in the language up. You can learn the language, the components of the language, fairly reliably. But one of the shifts that I've gone through recently is I've found limitations to that, in the sense that it kind of comes back to what we were talking about at the beginning of the discussion about language learning being so much more of a holistic task, almost like a skill. And so that if you spend too much time on discrete pieces of information, what you're actually doing is you're forfeiting time spent with the whole language, which, although it's slower, less tangible, much harder to actually grapple with and engage with and break down into learning tasks, actually over time, through the quantity of information, you are actually going to overtake, a bit like the tortoise and the hare situation. The tortoise overtakes the hare over the long term. And so now I really approach new languages with a slightly slower but more longer term perspective of saying, right, I'm going to take a quantity over quality approach, and I'm going to sacrifice a bit of quality at the beginning in service of getting as much exposure as possible over time. So I was wondering if there are, I think this is my endless fascination with the parallels between language learning and other disciplines. Are there any other disciplines or skills that you can think of where that kind of approach of actually let's maybe forego a bit of the detail now and learn through mass exposure over time? Are there any other disciplines where that sort of where those dynamics apply?
I would say that's the rule rather than the exception. So what you're talking about right here, so I mentioned one of the principles of this book is directness, and we kind of talked about a little bit of the research behind transfer and why I think this is important. And there's an interplay between what I call directness and drills. So drills are essentially isolating a cognitive aspect of the task you're trying to master. So this could be like if you're a basketball player doing layup drills, or if you are, a musician playing that tricky part of a piece as opposed to the whole song. Drills are a very important part of learning. And so I don't want to suggest that, the best way to become a basketball player, for instance, is to just play basketball a lot. That will get you there. Like, you're going to get good playing just basketball, but it's maybe not the optimal route to performance. And similarly, I think in language learning, there is a benefit to the kind of formal textbook flashcard style studying. I think that there is some value in that. Now, I think it's very easy to go overboard. And I think you're kind of having your like honeymoon phase and then your disillusionment with it. And I have the same thing. So I'll say one thing. When I use flashcards, I've like really gone to town with them. Yeah. But at the same time, I don't use them universally. So for instance, I don't use flashcards at all for any of the languages, even the ones I'm improving right now, just because I'm not at a point where I find them to be very helpful. And when I was learning Spanish, for instance, I didn't use flashcards at all. So when we were in Spain, I didn't use flashcards at all. I did use them a lot for Mandarin Chinese. And so what's the difference between Spanish and Chinese? And the reason is, again, I didn't really understand this at the time. It was just sort of a feeling it out. But now I understand what is the point of a drill. So the point of a drill is, in my opinion, twofold. So one of them is if the task that you're engaging in is too difficult for you to do right now. So if you're having a conversation with someone and it is unmanageable, like you are not able to actually execute on it, you need to actually break it into some pieces and learn those pieces first. So if I told you right now, okay, I'm going to give you a violin, go play in the symphony orchestra, what are you going to do, right? You're not going to be able to do that. Like, there is a sense that, okay, well, I'm going to try, but there's too much going on. You're not actually even approximating the thing that you need to be doing in that orchestra. So there's a sense that you do actually have to work on a simpler task. Now, languages, you can often do this organically by focusing on simpler conversational situations. So you don't have to start giving a, thesis presentation for your doctorate in, Japanese. You can start by, saying konnichiwa and like having a very simple interaction with someone. On the other hand, there are aspects of the conversation that might be irreducible. So you're not able to actually make it as simple as you'd like. And I found that in Chinese, because it had a different linguistic background, a different vocabulary background, that when people would say a new vocabulary word for me, I wouldn't stick. There would be no hooks mentally for me to record all the knowledge that I was learning or all the things that were happening. And so I did find flashcards very useful for supplementing my difficulties. But again, I think what matters here is looking at what's the relationship to the overall task. So the idea was, I'm having conversations in Chinese and it's overwhelming me to, like, I can't mentally process everything that's happening. I can't remember any of the words people are saying. I can't, there's even simple conversations I can't have, this kind of thing. And so I have to kind of break it off and simplify it and work on some components, but then you're bringing it back to that kind of holistic activity. So the reason I think the holistic activity and the reason I think directness is very important is because, again, a lot of what you're actually practicing is not really obvious from the get-go, not just in terms of which words you're using and which ways you're pronouncing things, but just that communicating is this like extremely complicated, multidimensional activity. And so if you just reduce it to, well, all these flashcards, I mean, you're probably missing 80% of what it actually means to communicate in this language well. And so you're getting really good at this 20%. And then there's this other,
wrong 20%.
Well, it can be very useful to add vocabulary. It can be very useful to, like, when I was in Spain, I did grammar practice because conjugation is kind of, okay, wait, I have to be able to, past tense, and wait, is it the perfect past tense or like,
I mean, I was referring to because 80-20 often do the 20% of stuff that gets you 80% of the results, but in this case it's the 20% of stuff that gets you 20% of the results.
We're talking just to add, because you asked how does this apply to other things, but I mean, almost all skills I think are like this, that you want to start with a concrete application situation. And if you're going to do drills, if you're going to do study theory, if you're going to practice some sub skill, it should be with this interplay from that central kind of concrete example. So if you're programming, pick a project that you want to actually make, right? Yeah. Don't just learn a bunch of abstract computer science and then just hope a couple years later you'll finally be able to do it. So languages are like that. Every skill is like this. This is really kind of a universal truth of learning.
Yeah, it reminds me of the task of learning Chinese characters, which I've kind of been doing on and off for much longer than I would like to have been doing on and off for. But it's like this thing of the task of, I don't know whether you learned any Chinese characters when you were doing Mandarin, but the task of learning Chinese characters or Japanese kanji in my case, it's very easy and very tempting to break it down. And indeed, most of the methods that teach Chinese characters, they do take the approach of, right, let's learn the radical and then learn the rest of the character, and then a lot of rote copying it out, and then you learn the different pronunciations, etc., etc. Basically, spending an inordinate amount of time on individual characters, and then in order to properly learn them. Yeah. But then, I've had some conversations with some very smart people, or I should say, some people who are who've been extremely successful at the task of learning Chinese characters, and then actually using them to communicate and use the language in the long term. And they all say the same thing, which is that, ultimately, none of this stuff matters unless it's existing in context. And so even if they kind of, if you're pushing them, they would even go so far as to say that even the act of trying to learn individual characters and the component parts in a very micro way, I mean, yes, you can learn stuff in that way, but really the only task that matters is actually going out there and reading real stuff and learning the characters in the context of the article or the text or whatever it is that you're learning. And even though it feels impossibly hard, and even though it feels like it's something that's almost a complete waste of time because there is such a gap between where you are and where you want to be in terms of comprehension, it's actually only through that most holistic of activities that you can actually start to get together the skills that you need to be able to process these huge amounts of information and make sense of them. And so it strikes me very much as what you were talking about there. Although,
it's so funny because you're talking about Chinese characters, so this is like, because I have a lot of thoughts. Because I will tell you.
Tell me, it's in the book.
Cool. No, it's not in the book. It's. I could talk about this book for 3 hours and there'd still be tons of stuff that we didn't cover in the book, so I'm not worried about that. But the thing about the Chinese characters, which I think is very interesting, because I've learned them because I didn't go to a school to learn Chinese, because everyone who goes to school to learn Chinese learns it a certain way, and I did not. So I did not learn it that way. And so it's very funny because I have a very odd kind of pairing of abilities. So for instance, I was studying it very little just so that I could do the HSK4 when I was in China. This was like 5 years ago. But I basically have spent very little time learning to write Chinese characters. So right now, I've been practicing for a while, and I would, not just from the 3 months I was in China, but I would say that I'm able to read fairly fluently Chinese. I've read a couple novels, and I don't usually need a dictionary to read Chinese, but I wouldn't be able to write out like even simple sentences in Chinese with a pen. And it's an example of, again, we're talking about those differences in the knowledge. So do I know Chinese characters is a very interesting question, because it means, in what way do I know Chinese characters? Because sure. I would be able to recognize and read fluently probably about 3,000 characters. And there's characters that I don't know that I'm able to guess how it's pronounced and guess how it's, thing. But if you ask me, okay, could you write like some very, 101 level sentences, I wouldn't be able to do it.
Yeah.
I just wouldn't be able to do it. Like I couldn't even write like very simple things in Chinese with a pen. I can do it with the phone, but it was just, for me, when I started learning it, it was, well, actually handwriting isn't super important to me. Like it is something that would maybe matter eventually, but my goal for learning characters is I want to be able to read, and I want to be able to, chat with the phone and stuff, and like, Google things. And like, so as long as I can use it with the pinyin entry method, like I don't really care so much. And I find that very interesting, because a lot of people, not to say that not learning to write is bad. I think one day I would like to be able to handwrite better, because now, at least at my point in Chinese, it's becoming a bit embarrassing. But when I was starting out, I think it's funny that there's so many people that they can't string together 3 sentences and they're doing handwriting drills. It just, to me, is like, ever ask yourself, what are you actually trying to do with Chinese? Like people just assume, well, the only way to memorize it is that you have to write out like every single character 400 times. I mean, yeah, if you want to be able to handwrite beautifully, I mean, that's what Chinese kids do in class, because they have to be able to write with pen and paper, and they already speak Mandarin as like their native language. But if you are a foreigner and you are trying to decide, okay, I want to have conversations with people, well, maybe don't learn characters at all. Like, I know there's some sinologists that recommend not even learning characters at all. I found it useful to learn characters because just for the mental mnemonic effects.
Yeah.
But even then, if you're learning characters, it's possible to learn to recognize characters fluently without being able to write them. And so these are just kind of different questions and different issues. And it's definitely a lot easier to learn to recognize with like accuracy at the level where you could read fluently than it is to be able to handwrite them. It's probably about, I would say probably about 2 or 3 times as much work to be able to handwrite them.
Yeah, it's interesting. How would you characterize your journey of, say, from, let's say, Chinese character number 500 that you learned? Because that's kind of the first couple of hundred, they're fairly formulaic, they're pictographic often. How would you characterize that how have you gone about getting to the point where you are now, let's say 3,000, from like 500 or early stage, semi-early stage up to that 3,000? How have you, I guess, maybe I could ask, how have you applied the principles of ultralearning to that particular time?
Right. So a lot of this work happened after I was in China. So we were talking about like, how do you maintain and grow your language? So I never really got to this point, but Chinese was an example of like, I felt like I did fairly well for 3 months in China. So for those of you who are learning Mandarin, after 3 months, I wrote and passed the HSK4, which China says is equivalent to a B2. It's not. It's less than a B2, but that's their benchmark. But I mean, it's a fairly intermediate kind of test. Like you actually have to know a little bit of conversing, and you have to be able to read, and you also, in my case, you have to be able to handwrite. Although I was very rudimentary for that section when I was doing the handwriting, so I didn't emphasize it that much. And the feeling I had after that was that Chinese is great. I find it really interesting. I really liked my time in China. I'm not at a level of Chinese where I felt like I'm really able to do what I want to do in Chinese. Like Spanish, I kind of felt like, well, I know I'm not perfectly fluent, but everything I want to do in Spanish, I'm able to do. So didn't feel like a huge amount of pressure to get to like a true bilingual level with it. Whereas Chinese, I was like, you know what, I want to keep learning it. So the first step I found is I had this deck of Chinese characters. So I kept doing the Chinese characters with the flashcards. I probably did them a little bit long. So at that time, I wasn't as aware of the kind of graded reader strategy of getting into reading Chinese. And I did that a little bit late. So I think I maybe did the characters a little bit more than I would have otherwise. And then I think the right strategy for going into reading Chinese is that I broke it down into first graded readers. So I think it's called Mandarin Companion is a really good, very intro one. I've got a few on my bookshelf up there that are graded readers. Graded readers are good, like if let's say, again, like you said, a couple hundred characters. So you've done a little bit of practice initially and you want to start reading actual text. Graded readers are good for that, especially because they restrict the vocabulary, so you're not going to get stuck with things. Then after you go graded readers, I would suggest getting texts of books that you're actually interested in or native level material, and do it with Pleco's character recognizer. So you can get the text reader application on Pleco, and then that way you can like load a web page or load like a TXT file of a book, and then you can just with a tap of your finger translate words you don't understand. So how do you get
the book from? Do you take a physical book and scan it onto?
You have to find like a digital copy of the book. So for me, one of the first ones I read was Liu Cixin's Santi, which is hit like 3-body problem, which is like a famous Chinese science fiction novel these days. And that was one of the first ones I did. And I actually found the Pleco plus that was fairly easy because when I didn't understand a word, if it was a scientific kind of word, it was something that I was like, I knew what that was in English. So when you type it and it's like, oh, this is proton. And I'm like, okay, I didn't know what that was in Chinese, but now I do. And so I started there. And so I did, I think, at least one book on the Pleco so that it was just, it was very fluid to do dictionary lookups when I wanted to. And then after I did that, I started reading books with paper books with dictionary in hand. That's more cumbersome, and I would not recommend it if you don't have that. Like, you should be aiming to like be looking up no more than like 4 or 5 characters per page, because I think if your idea is that like, well, every sentence you have to look up like 2 or 3 characters, it's just going to be so tedious you're never going to get through it. So I think, again, like Pleco is good for that. Pleco could be good if you have to look up like a character per sentence, because it's fast enough that it's still not too tedious to read and you can get to native level material. And then reading with an actual book, And so I've read a couple books now with just the book and the phone at the side. And now recently I've been reading it, and I usually don't even look things up. So usually it's at a point now where if I'm missing a word, it's like, I know what's happening. Like, it's just kind of like, oh, this is some Chengyu that I'm not familiar with, but it means something like this.
And so just to press pause on that for a second then. So is there anything worth highlighting then about the activity of reading with the character recognition software and the actual process of learning it? Or is it just quite literally a question of like repetition and gradual iteration until you kind of recognize and quote unquote know that
thing
stuff?
About learning, again, Chinese or learning any language, it's kind of like this, but the problem is the goal activity you have. So we're talking about directness, and this is a big principle, but the problem is that the thing you actually want to be able to do is too difficult, right? So the question is, how do you build that ladder, that staircase that will get you there in sort of useful ways, right? So we've already talked about there's not useful ways that you can do this activity that's not actually leading towards the thing that you want to be good at. And one of the ways in conversations, and why I think conversations are a good starting point for learning languages, aside from just being that's kind of what languages are at their kernel, is conversational abilities and one-on-one communication. But that if you are starting at a conversational level, it's a lot easier to simplify that task, because even if especially if you're traveling and you're trying to do something, or you're trying to order food at a restaurant, you can often do that without knowing any of the language. You just like point to things and grunt and stuff. And so building your language from that ability it's easy to bootstrap it. Native level reading materials are not like that. Like, native level reading materials are often way too difficult, and there's no real easy access point. So for Chinese, again, it depends on your ability with the language. Like, I found with Spanish, I could just go straight into native level media because there weren't any characters to recognize.
Yeah.
I didn't have to do the graded reader route. But for Chinese, I found that it was very valuable because again, learn a few hundred characters, graded readers starting from level 1, which are like super simplified and you can read the story, and then do harder graded readers, and then do Pleco with the document reader. And again, the Pleco with the document reader is just to smooth the transition. So I don't think that the issue of, like, again, if you just tap on the words, maybe that's not the ideal way to learn those vocabulary items. I'm not really talking about that so much as just if you want to read, let's say, an actual book in Chinese, and you have to look up every word in an actual, phone or even worse, like a paper dictionary. It's just a nightmare, right?
So it's the activity that allows you to actually engage in the task that you want to be engaging in ultimately. Mm-hmm. So it's like that stepping stone. Scott, I'm mindful of time. We've been I mean, I could just go on for hours. But I guess there's so much more I want to ask you. We haven't really strayed from the language learning arena either, which is something for next time, I guess. But
next time we'll talk about something else.
Yeah, tell people first of all where they can find you, where they can find your work, right, and then also where they can get themselves a copy of Ultralearning.
So I would highly recommend checking out my website, scotthyoung.com. That's SCOTTHYOUNG.com. There I'll also have links to the book. So if you want to get your book, it's going to be available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, wherever you get your books. If you're listening in the United States or North America, generally the book is going to look like this. There it is, Ultralearning.
For those of you on the podcast, it's a green cover.
Yes, it's a green cover in the States. In the UK edition, which I don't have a copy of right now, is a yellow cover. I'm not sure why they use different covers, but they do. And so if you're sort of like, oh, which book? They're both my book. It's just one of them, they change the spelling a little bit.
Yeah.
But otherwise,
we use funny spelling.
Yeah. And I think especially, again, if you're interested in learning languages and you want to understand some of the principles behind effective learning, I think that this would be a good book. But also, again, language learning is just we're talking about it a lot here, and obviously it's a subject that's dear to my heart, but there's so many other learning related things. So if you've wanted to, approach learning programming or sports or improve job skills or all those sorts of things, I also talk about them a lot in the book and apply these same ideas and principles. So I think if you've listened this far and you're this interested in learning principles, then I highly recommend checking the book.
Yeah, well, that was one of the things that I noticed when I was just researching the book. Actually, in the introduction, I'm just trying to pull it up here. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to find it, but of course, learning new skills, actually, it's not just for the sake of it, is it? Because you can actually use that to really make any change in your life you want, whether that's getting a new job, getting a promotion, becoming a happier person.
Well, yeah.
I mean, you know,
this is really the art of learning itself. And I think that if you are serious about this, again, it's not just to learn frivolous skills, although obviously I think there's no skill that's truly frivolous. There's lots of useful skills out there, but this is also, if you want to get better at your career, if you want to be able to master skills that will be, you know, rewarding in your life and have great value to you, this is sort of also the approach that I would recommend taking. And so I think, again, a lot of people here are very interested in language learning. So we've spent a lot of time talking about language learning, and I could probably talk about it for another couple of hours.
Yeah.
But I think, again, the point of writing this book was also to try to show what are those universal principles, so that if you're approaching a new subject or you're approaching a new thing that you have, you know, you've never approached that before, this book will give you the roadmap.
Well, listen, Scott, it's been absolutely fascinating. We're going to have to schedule a round 2 for some time, but until next time, thanks for your time. Thanks for all the insights, and I really encourage everyone to pick up a copy of the book. Not because I've read it myself, I confess, but because I've followed your work for long enough to know that anything that's in this book is going to be priceless. So thanks again.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. And you know, here at StoryLearning, everything that I do is powered by stories, whether that's writing books, teaching lessons, crafting courses. My mission is to help everyone succeed at learning a new language through the power of story. And we now have comprehensive language courses in over 15 languages, from Spanish to French, Korean to Japanese, and across all levels from beginner to mastery. And you can take a 7-day free trial of any of these programs by visiting storylearning.com/courses. I've poured my heart and soul into creating these courses over the last 10 or so years, and we've helped tens of thousands of new students achieve their dreams of learning a new language, all through the power of story. So go ahead and take a free trial. There's no commitment. You can try out our method for free. See if this can also be the breakthrough for you that it's been for so many other people. StoryLearning.com/courses.